Hi there, Mathew Klickstein here again, host and producer of the Nerd and Geek Culture podcast, NERTZ. For those who are joining us the first time, welcome. NERTZ is a unique podcast in which I reassess, reinvestigate, and repurpose a series of interviews I conducted over the years 2013 and 2014 for a book of mine on, you guessed it, nerd and geek culture and its changing face over the years, which came out in 2018 and was called Nerding Out. For this particular episode of NERTZ, I am so excited to bring to you an interview that I conducted with legendary comic book writer Len Wein. If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably already well aware of who Len Wein was. He passed away in 2017, but over the course of his expansive career, he really was one of the most predominant figures in the scene and really pop culture overall. Just to name a few of his many, many creations, we're talking here about Swamp Thing, Wolverine, many of the other X-Men characters, Lucius Fox from Batman, and of course he was also the editor of the pioneering graphic novel by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons, Watchmen. When I spoke with Len, what I really wanted to focus on here during our hour-long conversation in which he was congenial, funny, and like an open textbook, frankly, was the idea of how comic books had changed over the years, from when he first got started in the early days, when it was really more of a niche market, to something that's become a major staple not only in pop culture, but really culture overall. What was Len's take on this idea, the fact that comic books had changed so dramatically over the time that he had been working on them, from something that was a little more underground, if you will, and certainly niche market, to something that was out there and as mainstream as could be?
Yeah, I actually watched an episode of Jeopardy a couple of nights ago, and Comic-Con was the answer to one of the questions. It's reached that point. There is a diagram of the history of scientific evolution from the dawn of man until last Tuesday. And if you look at the chart basically is virtually a flat line across thousands of years from the start to about 150 years ago, to where it almost makes a vertical climb. It's amazing to watch, and I think comic book fandom and Comic-Con is very much like that. We were all in our little niche, those of us who loved the medium and what it could bring to us. And then one day, especially once the San Diego Con started to grow and moved to the convention center where there was more room, some PR guy at some film studio went, maybe we can pitch our new movie to that audience. They're almost a certainty to at least the majority of them want to see it, and word of mouth will get around and we'll see what we can do. And it worked, and suddenly it became not quite so Comic-Con. And I think that's kind of what's happened with the entire medium of the fandom. As I like to say, we won. The geeks have inherited the earth.
I have a good friend who's written for DC Comics amongst many other mainstream and smaller comic book companies. He teaches on the subject and is really something of a scholar in the field. He told me at one point that Chicago was home to one of the first big comic book conventions, and even back then they were already bringing in professional wrestlers from the WWF, which was basically a precursor to the WWE of today. He told me that this was maybe the first time that there was such an intersection between what you could refer to as the comic book superheroes and the kind of real-life superheroes that we see in more or less professional wrestlers. This, in turn, may have been the forefront of that significant but slow change from comic book fandom as a niche market to something of more of a mainstream affair that brought in, at least on the convention level, these larger pop culture influences. A fascinating idea, but apocryphal perhaps? What did Len have to say about this story?
I think that's very much the case. I remember the wrestlers being among the first of the celebrities to start showing up at conventions, and there'd be huge lines to get their autographs and their photos. That definitely is an aspect of what grew. But I think part of it, too, is that the folks who run the studios now, who produce the films, who direct the films, who write the films, are all comic book fans.
Right.
They all grew up on this medium, and they have carried it. Now that technology has managed to finally be able to duplicate what Jack Kirby could do with a pencil.
Right.
the industry has become very much about comic books and the things that they wanted to see when they were kids. I mean, I loved it. I thought it was one of the best movies of the year after going into it with great dread. But to find that Guardians of the Galaxy has now become the third highest grossing movie of all time flatters me. It flattens me. It just leaves me going, okay, fine. I guess there's not much we can't do anymore. Even something that virtually no one had ever heard of when the movie came out is, you don't have to be a comics fan to be a comics fan anymore.
But does this kind of shift somewhat dilute the whole idea of comic book fandom and Comic-Cons themselves? Does the fact that more and more of these non-comic book elements are being dropped into the comic book fandom and comic convention scene not only take away from the power of the actual comic book folks in it, but also that of some of those earlier adopters who came into the field with, say, more like-minded movies and TV shows, such as Lloyd Kaufman's no-budge sci-fi horror campfests under his Troma banner, Lloyd himself being a mentor of a sort to the young James Gunn, director of Guardians of the Galaxy. Folks like Lloyd and his Troma team, to expand on the example, had a lot in common with the original Comic-Con scenes in the earlier days, but now are being shoved out of the way, sometimes literally, Lloyd himself has told me in the past, with the billion-dollar movie franchises taking their spot. How geeky, I asked Len, is that?
Yeah, I have reached a point, and I realized this past year, that I'm really almost not capable of addressing that particular question, honestly, because I don't have the same comic convention that anyone else has. Mm. You know, I am a fan at heart. I still love the things I love. I still geek out. I mean, I have a book coming out today, and I can't wait to get to the comic shop and get my copy to see how it came out. But I, you know, I've been doing it 50 years. I have reached, you know, God help me, TV Guide referred to me as a god once, so I guess I reached godhood in this industry, and I don't see the convention the way a lot of the other people do. I have friends on a lot of the top shows, you know, that premiere there. So if I want to go see the panel on Big Bang Theory, for example, they make sure I get seats. And, you know, it's not like the fan, the true fan, who's waited online for 3 nights in the rain on the lawn to get into that room for that panel on that day. Their convention experience is radically different than mine.
Fair enough. But did Len have some sympathy, I guess you could call it, for those fans outside of the world of the godlike pros as he deservedly was considered by the scene he helped build, who may have indeed felt that aspects of the comic scene and fandom scene overall were being hijacked in a way by these much larger, much more powerful outside forces, whose interests might have not exactly aligned with the ethos of what made the scene able to run the way that it did to begin with? Sure, there's always going to be trollish complaints about this kind of thing, especially with the rise of the internet and all. But Len's own very good friend Alan Moore himself made some valid points about how the masterpiece works of his, in particular, were attenuated by movie studios and filmmakers who might not have exactly gotten what it was that he intended. Not to mention the fact that the films made of them in the first place, which is something Moore never particularly liked the idea of, weren't really something that he ever wanted to happen. This even goes back to the discussion I had with other interviewees, and which floated around for a while when still relevant about the Big Bang Theory itself. Were the characters on that show quote-unquote real geeks, or just superficial ones constructed by folks who, again, might not have really gotten it, despite, of course, the fact that, well, a vast majority of those involved were quite geeky themselves, or at least claimed to be?
I think everybody is entitled to their own definition of what makes a geek and or nerd. I have a Sunday dinner at the house. We invite a bunch of friends over, and you know, everyone is any given Sunday night is anywhere from a dozen to 20 people here having dinner. We have a very large dining table, and so we all sit down at the table and talk. And just a few weeks back, the argument or the discussion was, okay, are you a nerd or a geek?
Yeah.
And we're talking, you know, people who go from, you know, literal fans, one of my very, very closest friends is nothing more. I mean, he's an actor professionally, but in terms of comics and the industry, he's a nerd. He's a fan, a real first-class geek. And then sitting next to him is David Gerrold, who invented the tribbles on Star Trek.
Right.
So it's that kind of group where there are actors and actresses and fans and people who aren't even in the business in any way, shape, or form, or just love it. And we're all arguing about, okay, are you a nerd, a geek, a fan? Which is it? And we could come to no conclusion among us who is which. I think everybody's entitled to their own definition of what makes you love the medium that you follow so faithfully. And we've all got our concerns. I mean, every time I was afraid Captain America was going to suck, and I thought the movies, both of them, that were terrific films. I loved them. And we all go into it with that fanish trepidation of is it going to match our vision? And one of the first things I learned as a professional writer is the vision changes. You need to write for the medium you're working in. So I have done adaptations of my own characters for film or for television, and made all kinds of changes because you've got to work for what the capacities and the limits and all of the above are for each medium you work in. And I think that's true of being a fan. I mean, I have mixed feelings about some of those fans who wait online for 3 or 4 days in the rain. I admire their determination, absolutely. But there's a level of selfishness to some of it, too. Especially when Twilight was coming out with those films, where there were thousands of people who just want to see what was going to be at the Twilight panel, what footage they were going to show, what members of the cast are going to be there. And for the first couple of years, until somebody figured it out and learned better, the panel was usually like 3 or 4 o'clock Saturday afternoon. And those fans would get into the room, whether it was Hall H or Ballroom 20, and camp out for the entire day, waiting for their panel. They didn't care about the 5 or 6 panels that preceded theirs. They really paid no attention to what was going on stage. But they were taking seats from people who really wanted to see those panels, just so they could make sure they had seats for their panel.
Was that something that ever interrupted a panel that you were involved in, or a friend, or something like that?
No. I mean, it's just the people on the panel are aware that half the audience here isn't here to see me or to discuss the thing I'm promoting or I love. They're here for something 3 hours from now, just to make sure they have seats for it.
The question then, of course, becomes one we've been investigating throughout the NERTZ podcast series. Why is it that there are those true believer fans out there who remain so rigid about tradition and heritage in fandom and geek culture? Why are they so intimately connected to the characters and comics of old-school sci-fi shows like Star Trek or films like the original Star Wars and so forth? Does this have anything to do, I asked Len, with what profound folklorist Joseph Campbell used to talk and write about, in saying that he felt a certain degree of anxiety and lostness as the result in our culture of lacking the kinds of ritual and cultural guideposts that we had in older myths and storytelling. Hence why fans today are trying to find these kinds of guideposts and ideas of life and how to lead it and how to be people living together in the world that we have today through such new films and TV shows like those mentioned, or certainly in comic books like the ones that Len wrote.
Wow, that is above my pay grade, I think, to answer. I don't think it's... I mean, okay, I've been a professional. I've been doing this my life. I always consider myself one of the luckiest men in the world that I've gotten to spend half a century doing something I adore. That was precious to me when I was a kid. But I'm still a geek, too. I mean, on Tuesday, this house has got a lot of nights. It's almost like I don't know, like a club. On Tuesday night, my sister-in-law and Melinda Snodgrass, who was one of the great Star Trek The Next Generation writers and is one of our viewers, come over so we can watch our favorite shows. We have dinner, and then we all sit down and we watch The Flash, and we watch Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and we watch Person of Interest, which is a show we all adore. And so we're just the same. And Melinda tells me, I'm almost caught up to this season of Arrow. I've been speed watching, same thing. She binge watches the last 2 seasons. I just got season 2, and I spent the last 3 days watching season 2 of Arrow to catch up. So we're doing it. We're professionals.
Yeah.
I don't think it has anything to do with anything more than a love of the material.
Len went on to tell me that he's such a true blue fan and geek, in his own words, that he had not 1, not 2, but 3 DVRs that were all completely full of the shows he was binging. Which begged the question, as someone who was going to these cons, who was talking to interviews such as myself on a regular basis, who was also very active in his own writing and creation works, how the heck did he have so much time to stay up on it all, and both watch and create as much as he did?
I am fortunate in that I have the ability to multitask. So I have the TV on in my office all the time, even when I'm writing. And I try to clear as much as I can. I can watch some of the mystery shows, especially after 50 years of being a professional writer, look at the first 2 minutes and go, she's a killer. And, not pay as much attention to it for the rest of the hour.
Without continuing to get too specific and personal into Len's own worldview and sphere of awareness, I switch gears here a bit into delving into that whole Batman versus Superman dichotomy in comics. That concept where we have to think about Superman as this nearly perfect, flawless, ideal creature for the most part, while Batman is quite flawed and, human. He's one of us. Bold, big, and beautiful, he's still something of an underdog in comparison at least to Superman and many other so-called superheroes. Len himself worked a great deal in comic stories in which the character superheroes were at times as much a burden as they were an advantage. Think here of the many subplots of his X-Men stories, for example. Think of Swamp Thing, who was at once an ultimate misfit or outcast, but also, a big, bulky, beefy superhero. Having worked on such projects as Watchmen, in which the superheroes were greatly humanized, for lack of a better word, in which their day-to-day problems were as much a part of the story as anything else, what was Len's take on the changing face of just what it means to be a misfit versus superhero, even within the fictional world of comics and such stories themselves?
It probably starts with Stan and Spider-Man. That was one of those most brilliant concepts, where Spider-Man literally was one of us, except for the powers. Yeah. He became Spider-Man to get away from his life as Peter Parker, because his life as Peter Parker sucked.
Yeah.
And even after getting all these great superpowers, it still sucked.
Yeah.
The biggest mistake I thought they ever made was when he started to date Mary Jane Watson, because, suddenly this geek nerd, pick your favorite word, is dating one of the most beautiful women in the world. And your problems are, it just kind of changes the dynamic in the book.
And boom, there we go again. As Len himself so proudly declared at the beginning of this episode, the geeks have won. The geeks are now the winners. It's the entire premise of this series and my book Nerding Out, along with, what does that do to the realm of not just fandom and geeks and nerds, but the misfit culture overall? When I spoke during this time of my interviews with some of the executive producers, writers, directors, and actors from the cult hit Revenge of the Nerd about this idea, even they told me that the studio is considering not only a reboot of the film, but of switching the concept and making the jocks the losers and the nerds the winners from the get-go. So what does this mean? When more and more we're seeing this kind of shift, at least in pop culture machinations today, where people are quite literally competing to be the nerdiest nerds of them all.
It's been that way, I think, for at least a quarter of, 25 years ago, I guess, probably. I went back home for my high school reunion, my 25th high school reunion. That shows you how old I am. And, there were 2 of us. It was the old gang, although, as I like to say, I don't know why they sent their parents, but they did. And, most of them, they were wearing suits, or some of the guys just actually came in shirts and jackets, and, not sport jacket, but, windbreaker kind of things. It was the neighborhood gang, most of whom still lived in the neighborhood. Only 2 of us showed up in tuxedos. I was one. And there was another guy there, this tall, thin, silver-haired, really good-looking guy who I barely remembered, who I really later discovered had been the heavy-set computer nerd, or the equivalent of it, back in our class, and had always been picked on, who now ran, a huge internet corporation in Silicon Valley and was a multimillionaire.
Right.
And I was the other, success story from our school. And all the guys who used to bully me when we were kids followed me around like puppy dogs the entire night. Mm-hmm. One of them even said to me, he says, do you think I could maybe get your autograph before the night's out? I said, sure. Why not? He said, oh, thank God, maybe they'll finally give me some validity with my kids. At which point they went, oh my God, we won.
Len Wein earned his way to nerdom's success. He did the time. He went through the grueling rites of passage. Hell, he's quite literally one of the people who strove forth into having nerds everywhere win, as he's repeated here. But going back to the Big Bang Theory question, or the idea of someone like, say, self-professed super nerd Chris Hardwick, who doesn't exactly look or seem like your typical nerd, or at least what used to pass for a typical nerd and geek. I mean, the guy was an original MTV VJ in his early 20s, for goodness sakes. Being considered a nerd or geek in the larger sense, well, what of that, Mr. Wein? And how does this affect how the geek community is seen by the larger populace, not to mention those who get to speak for or represent said community?
Water finds its own level. Isn't that the line? And I think that's true in anything. And I think the more verbose, the ones who've got the stronger personalities, will come out as sort of leaders of the community just by virtue of having the courage to open their mouths and speak. Mm-hmm. When a lot of other folks won't. And that can change how the community is perceived. It can change a lot of things, but it's nature. When you've got a community that has grown as exponentially as the comic book and comic-related media people have grown, it's pretty much, I bet you if someone were to do a scientific survey of who's what and how's whom, it breaks down like any other community. I think there's nothing that makes this particular community unique. It's just now more in the spotlight than it used to be.
Len had been speaking here about the interplay of the comic book world with the sci-fi fantasy world, and certainly were so many of us aware of this significant intersection in fandom. They may from the outside seem rather disparate. Comics are comics, sci-fi fantasy is sci-fi fantasy. So what is it that links the two realms to the point where these days they're practically one and the same?
It's partly how the greater community of humanity always thought of us. I think it's just, no one talks about, well, actually, I take that back. The more I think about it, the less I agree with myself. There are, baseball geeks and football geeks. It's just a word that has come to mean fan of. Yeah. Or obsessor over, depending on how involved you are. The word has just come to encompass fervent fan of, and you fill in the blank. It could be whatever.
I see.
I'm a Mucha, the famous artist of the last century, early on. I used to collect posters. There was a period in the 60s and 70s where all the old Alphonse Mucha illustrations were available as posters, and most of my first apartment was decorated in those posters because I loved his style. So I was kind of a Mucha nerd at the time as well as anything else. I think the words nerd, geek have really simply come to mean fervent fan of. And it no longer has to do completely or specifically at all with comics and the surrounding media.
From here, Len and I transitioned into the changing face and persona of comics and comic fandom. How comics have moved into that more mainstream pop culture scene that we've been discussing. And how that this has changed not only comics and the industry and conventions, but also some of the more iconic personalities that Len worked so closely with, such as Watchmen's Alan Moore, whom many consider to be the greatest living comic writer, and whom Len edited and in a way mentored, if you'll recall. It's also important to recall that this interview took place back in 2014 before Stan Lee, who will not surprisingly also be mentioned in Len's answer, passed away.
Alan is who Alan has become. I think we all turn into the character we used to play on TV. I always say that about Stan. I've known Stan Lee for half a century. And Stan Lee, the promoter, was a character he played. I mean, he was my boss. I could have lunch with him occasionally, and he was an absolutely normal guy. He was just a guy. Stan Lee Lieber. But on camera, he was Stan Lee, true believer, out there pitching the industry and the medium. And now that's all I see when I see Stan. I don't see the nice, normal guy. And I'm not saying he's abnormal in any way, but he's played that role for so long, he's become that role. And I think that's kind of what happened with Alan. Alan started out with this public persona, and professionally we got along great. We had no problems. I mean, every so often we'd argue about a line, or we'd argue about a plot direction we wanted to go in. But, we were professionals. We did our jobs, so we got along fine. And now he's become the character he used to play on TV.
Intriguing, though, again, not surprising, Len would bring up his old friend, colleague, and sometimes boss Stan Lee here. After all, the man is considered, even 2 years after he's passed, the master signifier and godhead, if you will, of the comics industry. And there's not really any use in disputing that perception, nor Stan's vital importance to the medium he helped to foster from its earliest days to the time he passed in 2018. And yet, there's a discussion that continues about just how much Stan actually physically did versus how much he sold and hyped, including the image of himself. Len and I discussed this, and went into how this affected the world of comics too, and how it's very similar to the debate that continues raging about Steve Jobs versus Steve Wozniak in the birth and promotion of Apple computers. Was Stan Lee in some ways the Steve Jobs, that visionary hype man, to Jack Kirby's Steve Wozniak, the guy who actually came up with a lot of ideas and did much of the ground floor work? And more importantly still, is this vital dynamic itself, in such creative duos as we've seen in certain other industries and origins of companies, products, movies, shows, and so forth, something that's just axiomatic?
It absolutely works that way. I had, I will say I had, because I don't see them very often anymore, and they've broken up, but I used to have dear friends who were a writing team, and they were, for like a decade or so, among the hottest writers in Hollywood. If I told you the movies they wrote together, you go, oh my God, and there's probably about 8 or 9 or 10 of them that were number one box office hits that they worked in together. And as a team, one of them was really the guy who went out and sold the projects and sold the properties. He was the guy who was great in the room, as they say, and could talk to the executives. The other one was the one who did most of the actual writing work when they sat down to write. The other contributed, but the bulk of what the structure and the work came out of the other partner. And that's a valid partnership. I mean, if you want to sell the projects and get them done well, you need one guy who can do each.
Yeah.
And I think that's true of all of it. I do not denigrate Stan's contributions. I mean, I grew up at Jack's feet. People have heard that story 1,000 times. Marv Wolfman and I used to go over to Jack's house on Saturday afternoons once a month. We'd bike over there as kids, and Roz would give us cookies, and we'd watch Jack work, because all Jack ever did was work. And his contributions are immeasurable. I mean, he has been a major, or was, God rest him, a major mover in every decade of the comic book industry. He and his then partner, whoever it was, whether it was Joe Simon or Stan Lee, introduced things into the industry that had never been there before. They created the first romance comics, things like, I mean, I could just go on, but Stan's contribution is always, well, Jack did all the work. Jack did much of the creative work, but most of the editorial direction and creative direction came from Stan. If you look at their work together and you look at the dialogue and you look at the art, you will realize that very subtly, frequently the dialogue is in direct opposition to the artwork, so that Stan can tell the story he intended to tell. And Jack drew what Jack wanted to draw, and Jack, there was never been a greater genius. So Jack could draw whatever he wanted, but Stan would occasionally say, I think this was actually a line during the period on the FF, when Jack went from the Inhumans to Galactus to the Black Panther, one right after the other, all these new things you've never seen before, where Jack said, that's great. I mean, Stan said, that's great, Jack, it's wonderful, but can we just slow down a little bit and explore this concept for a few issues before we go on to the next great idea?
Fair enough, and very gracious of the very, well, gracious Len to say. The problem may be being that there nevertheless continues to be a certain perception of Stan Lee that he is the man, that he did it all. Considering how often he continues to be name-dropped, how many times he appeared on screen throughout his career, how often he's put up there on the pedestal, all deserved. What did Len, though, think about how this impacted the perception of Stan's partner Jack Kirby, the guy who, after all, did do a lot of the work, as Len himself put it? Not only did Jack not really receive a lot of the glorification, at least not at the same level that Stan has over the years in the insular comic scene, that's true too in the pop culture and just mainstream culture world in general. Ask anyone on the street if he or she's heard of Stan Lee before. They probably have at least heard of the name. The same will likely not be true, sadly, of Jack Kirby.
That's a problem, but it always matters. I mean, I'm personally, although the folks on the X films have been wonderful to me, throughout. Lauren Schuler Donner is a marvelous, charming woman, and I'm very grateful for her friendship. But there's now been 7 X movies, counting the Wolverine solos, and my name is nowhere on any of them. Lucius Fox is one of my creations, too.
Yeah.
And I get no credit for that in the Batman movies. On the other hand, I get checks off of those 3 movies that bought me a lovely, lovely house I'm sitting in right now. So I can't complain about any of it. And Marvel and I, in the last couple of years, reached an accord between us where I now get a not inconsiderable amount of money from Marvel all the time to make up for all the years I didn't, but I still don't get the credit.
So Len did ultimately get a lot of the money that he was owed for the time, energy, and ideas that he invested into his many, many comic book stories. But he still didn't really get much credit for the movies and some of the other ancillary projects that came out based on those characters. As a writer, as a creator, what was that like for Len? Especially when he had to sit back and watch his many, many significant creations take on such a global life of their own. Lucius Fox? Wolverine? We're talking huge movie franchises, animation, merchandising, and other ancillary products, all based on Len's characters and work.
Ego notwithstanding, I have the credibility. I have the Sunday group includes a bunch of second generations. There are about a half dozen of what I call my adoptive kids who show up for Sunday dinners, and they're all in their mid-20s. They're all easily young enough to be my kids, in a couple of cases, probably young enough to be my grandkids. But they're all sharp, intelligent young men and women whose company I enjoy. And I realized one of them, when she first moved out here, got a job over at CAA, the agency. And the first Sunday she came to dinner after she got the job, she took me aside and said, "Can I talk to you for a minute?" I said, "Sure." And I said, "What's up? What's the you got a problem? Anything I can help?" She said, "No, I just want to know, do you have representation?" And at which point I knew, okay, this kid's going to make it. She's fine. And I said to her, "Sweetheart, no, I have 2 things that get me through any door in town. I have an attorney who's my wife, the Jeopardy champion, among other things. And as I've nicknamed her as an attorney, her nickname is Scorched Earth. So she takes care of all my business and contractual needs, and I've got my name.
Yeah.
There is no door in this town that's closed to me. All I have to do is, the creator of Wolverine wants to take a meeting, and I get a meeting. So I don't need an agency to go out and sell me.
Nearing the end of his life, being an outlandish success in an industry he helped to build, why was it that Len was choosing to continue forth and creating new projects anyway? As he himself would put it in his answer here, he certainly didn't need to create anything ever again, at least not financially.
I never have to work again if I don't want to.
Right.
I make enough in residuals and royalties and all of those interesting aspects that literally I could live a very comfortable life and never pick up a keyboard again.
Yeah.
I work because I love to work. I love doing this. This is my life, and I would wither without it.
Mm-hmm.
But the first year, I sat down to do my taxes and realized that year, probably 2/3 of my income, which was a good income for the year, had come from royalties and residuals. I felt guilty.
Yeah.
That I wasn't earning the money for new work. And I said this to my wife, who probably slapped me up one side of the head and down the other, and said, "You idiot, that's how it's supposed to work." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, the idea is you spend the first half of your career building up a body of work, and the second half of your career living off of it. Much of what I get money off of is things I don't even write anymore, but I get a creator's credit, and I have a contract that gives me guaranteed money from it, so I see money from those aspects. It's how you structure your career that ultimately determines how well you do at it."
As we began wrapping up the interview, I used this reasonable notion of Len's of how to smartly construct a sustainable career in comics or other creative mediums to switch back to our discussion earlier of that kind of competitiveness that has arisen over the past few years in geek culture. The idea of folks vying to be the nerdiest, the geekiest, of collecting them all, of being the first in line at the new screening of the big new film. What of this phenomenon being a byproduct of the mainstreaming of what was once a much more insular and niche industry and fandom scene?
We are by nature competitive. 10,000 years ago, we competed to see who could get to the, mastodon quick enough to have dinner. The fastest ones got to eat. The slowest ones got to die.
Yeah.
And I don't think that has changed in human nature in 10,000 years. I think it's simply that. It has very little to do, especially I think when you're fans. When you're just fans, this is not to denigrate anyone, because I'm a fan still. Yeah. But I think in many cases, being the first person online to see the new Star Wars, or being this or being that, gives you all you can manage to really get out of it, which is bragging rights. Mm. And I think bragging rights are precious to a lot of the people. And again, not just comic book, fandom, but any kind of fandom. I got to shake hands with, A-Rod. I got to do this. I was on the 50-yard line at the game where, the Giants won. Well, it's not the pennant, whatever that one is in football. It's just that sort of thing. They get to brag to their friends that they were at this important moment in time or met somebody who was important to the thing they're fans of. I think it's simply that human nature. Everybody wants to have value, and however you perceive your value is how you basically aim your life.
After a few more spirited discussions about the changing face of the comic book industry that Len helped to build, I asked him as an expert witness what were some of the representations in the mainstream media of the time that he felt best represented the world of comics and the continuum of comicdom.
Well, unlike somebody I mentioned earlier, I think the Big Bang Theory has a lot of that. I don't think they're fake nerds. I mean, as I said, today is Wednesday. It's New Comics Day. I'm going to the shop this afternoon. I have one nearby. The fact I've got a book coming out is minor. I go every Wednesday to pick up the new books and see what's out. And those guys are very much like that. And this is true of any industry, not just comic. But most of them, when they are portrayed in other mediums, or was true. I think nowadays, since so many of the people producing the work come from that background and know what it really was like, things are a lot more accurate than they used to be. But I would watch occasional TV shows where a cartoonist was portrayed, some of the mysteries where a cartoonist gets killed, or even things like Bob, the last of the Bob Newhart shows that used part of his name, where he was a cartoonist, were never accurate. That's not how comics were made at all. But it didn't matter, because the story wasn't about how to make comics properly. It was about who killed this guy or who this person was. And so you sort of sit and grin and bear it. My wife was a professional photographer before she became an attorney. And she's always watching shows, even now, and going, that's not right. The photographers don't do that. But it's not important, because it's about telling a story as opposed to writing a book on the history of photography, for argument's sake.
Finally, what did Len think about the wave of so-called underground, or perhaps more malign term, alternative comics that had been exploding out of the 1980s and 90s? We're talking here acolytes of the likes of R. Crumb, such as Daniel Clowes, Peter Bagge, Linda Barry, the Hernandez brothers, Johnny Ryan, Shannon Wheeler, Ivan Brunetti, Phoebe Gluckner, and their ilk. Folks who outright said a big no to the mainstream comic scene for the most part and forged ahead to create, write, draw, and often even publish and distribute their own weird little comics as a true clarion call from the misfit enclave. Did Len see these people and their work as a kinds of heir apparents to the works that he and his friends were creating back when comics were first really starting to break out into the mainstream?
I think they are people who are passionate about the medium, want to do comics, have been unable to find an outlet for the kind of work they want to do, and so have taken it upon themselves to publish themselves, and I think more power to them. They're a lot more liberal in that respect, that you can voice whatever it is that matters to you, to the public. And people will listen or not listen as per their inclination.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for listening to yet another episode of NERTZ, the Nerd and Geek Culture Podcast. I am once again your host and producer, your head nerdzer, Mathew Klickstein here. Want to just say how incredibly grateful I am that I was able to speak to Len Wein before he passed away in this interview that we did in 2014. As you can tell, Len was incredibly congenial, warm, funny, and I just feel really, really lucky that I had an opportunity to speak with him before he was gone. Obviously, his contributions to the comic book world and pop culture and just storytelling are immeasurable. I'm so glad that we had him around to create the characters and stories and comics that he did, that he was able to work with so many different people and really mentor an entire generation, maybe 2 or 3 others, in fact, who became some of our biggest comic book folks today. Want to thank also Shane Ivers. He did the music Factory Madness. So thank you, Shane, and definitely check out his website and his music. That's Shane Ivers, Ivers. And again, that music is Factory Madness is that song. Really fun 8-bit sounding chiptune song. Obviously very appropriate for a Nerd and Geek Culture podcast. So anyway, if you haven't had a chance to hear some of our other episodes, feel free to check that out. You can find them on my website. That's MathewKlickstein.com, MathewKlickstein.com. And that's the NERTZ podcast. That's NERTZ. So anyway, keep listening in and keep staying nerdy and geeky, and we'll see you next time. Thanks again for listening to this tribute episode to Len Wein of NERTZ. Bye-bye.